All right, and the author of the piece joining us right now, getting a little bit of fresh air out and about. I assume getting some daily exercise in during your
That's right.
your
Governor
stint at home.
mandated, right?
You got it. All
Yeah,
right, Doug. Thank you
that's right.
for taking a little bit of time and chatting
You
with
bet.
us about this piece. Did anything surprise you when you compared the two events? Any of the correlations between the Spanish influenza and what we're experiencing today?
Well, I think the one thing that jumped out at me is just kind of this kind of careless attitude that Portlanders seem to have in a lot of ways. I think that the correlation between the two situations is that people don't really want to be told what to do and told to stay home. You see a lot of activity in 1918 when this is really ramping up that's kind of reminiscent of the lines of people in their cars this last weekend heading out to the Oregon coast. I also saw some similarities between the public officials kind of taking their own sweet time to come to the conclusion to really kind of close things down. I think if you look at Mayor Wheeler and Governor Brown and the silly press conference that they had last Wednesday, it's very similar to a lot of things that you might have heard of from Portland Mayor George Baker, who was the mayor of Portland during the time of the influenza of 1918. He didn't really want to shut Portland down. And he was told to by the U.S. Surgeon General and public health officials. He was told, no, you need to close this place up. And he said, what about the economic impact that's going to have on this city? So again, I see some, kind of wavering in public officials when we look at both of these pandemics.
And to be fair, the Spanish influenza of 1918 cases and deaths seemed to spike a lot more quickly then compared to when they reacted as opposed to today. But I do want to quote somebody from your article, Dr. E.A. Sommer, who said of the 1918 Consolidated Health Board, they put it this way, said, quote, the biggest thing we have had to fight in the influenza epidemic has been apathy, or perhaps the careless selfishness of the public. When you look at how different cities handled the Spanish influenza, as we kind of glimpse at what's happening today and how different cities and states are kind of taking to the what means they're willing to go to stop the spread, how did you see the comparisons then with how seriously places took it and then how many people got sick or died?
Well, when I take a look at the two, and Professor Chris Nichols was a guest on our podcast, the Kick-Ass Oregon History podcast we did on this subject, so people can listen to him talk about it. But he really kind of looked in kind of a more national response. And, he gave kind of the famous example of Philadelphia, which was a city that had a lot of soldiers and sailors. Those are the primary vectors of this disease in the early and middle stages, right? And so they were having war bond parade and all kinds of people coming out, just masses of folks lining the streets for this war bond parade. And thousands of people died weeks later. So I think we look at cities that really didn't clamp things down versus other cities that really did clamp it down. And Portland's kind of in the middle, right? Portland kind of has these waves of kind of edicts that Mayor Baker puts into place to kind of roll in further isolating folks, limiting groups of people, and so on. So Portland's kind of in the middle, and because of that, the 1918, 1919 influenza went on for months in Portland, Oregon, and people kept dying. It was something that they just had to deal with for a long, long time. But hopefully. Essentially, their curve was flattened as well within Portland by the social distancing and some of the public health initiatives that they took care of.
Doug, one of the big questions I think people have right now, how long will the social distancing last? How long will restaurants remain closed? All the impacts that we're seeing on our daily lives and our economy right now. Did you get any hint as to how things might go this time around compared to looking at the way it all processed back 100 years ago?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when Portland was closed, and it's really kind of a loose close, stores were open until 3:30 p.m. People were still taking mass transit and so on, but the schools were out. You couldn't go to church, you couldn't have large public gatherings and that sort of thing. So that went on for 6 weeks. And what happened is, this is during World War I, is November 11th, 1918, the war ended, right? And the closure at that point had been about 6 weeks long. And Mayor Baker wanted to allow Portlanders to have a huge festive party and to kind of get life back to normal, right? And so he allowed the closure to end just 5 days later. And so what happened is all of these people that have been pent up and all these people that have had their lives modified rushed out into the streets. Portland about that time was roughly around 250,000 people. Everybody's out in the streets and close together, and their bodies are just right upon one another. And what happens? A few weeks later, flu cases start spiking again, right? And people start dying again. So I think that when we look at this, and I'm sure public health officials, I certainly hope they have, are looking at what's going to happen when we're finally told, okay, you don't have to stay at home anymore. You can actually go out and get into groups and be with lots of people. You know, I'm a little concerned at looking at history at kind of what happens then. And that's kind of a sucky answer because I know everybody wants to get out.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that is a sucky answer, but it is the answer that I think a lot of people are finding. They're finding the same answer to that question. Doug, Kent Crispin, thank you so much with Willamette Week. I appreciate, as journalists, we're all looking for different ways to cover this, but this was a really great way to give us some perspective on what we're dealing with now and taking a look at something that we've seen happen similarly in our past. I appreciate your time today.
You bet. And next time, let's get together and talk about like waterfalls and rainbows or whales. Or
you know what?
Okay?
It's a date, buddy. Perfect.
Thanks. Have a good one.